I wanted to do this video from when I started recording videos, but I'm terrified of the consequences of this videos. The personal consequences to me for this video are extreme. So, let's get to it. First, let's start by defining our terms. And as we do this, let's be clear. Definitions are determined by usage. Language is a living thing. So the original intent may change over time, because over time, the definitions of the terms change. I want to talk about immigration. Let's start here. If you are at least 50% or more First Nations, contextually as the Canadians use it as, in other words, if you were here before the English, French, and Spanish colonized, if you're at least 50% descended from First Nations, you're not an immigrant. For the people that immigrated here prior to the American Civil War, of European descent, you're colonizers. You don't have claim to the land. Now let's actually talk about the systemic problems with immigration. Prior to 1792, there were no federal immigration laws. Immigration was handled locally, either in the county or the municipal level. Those decisions were made by judges that were either elected or appointed in the areas, and they used their judgment, their opinion, their experience. You were granted citizenship to the United States based on their decision. In 1792, there were two acts that were passed through the Congress. The Alien Friends Act, the Alien Enemies Act. The Alien Friends Act actually put down guidelines for what needs to be done to become a citizenship. Forgive me, let me rephrase that so it makes more sense. The Alien Friends Act provided guidelines for what is required to acquire citizenship in the United States. Specifically, one guideline: you have to live here for a certain amount of time. The other less important guidelines, because they would be overturned by other legislation later, is you had to be white and you had to be able-bodied. So, as of 1792, the immigration law that ruled the United States was you had to be white, you had to be able-bodied, and you had to live here a certain amount of time. That was the Alien Friends Act in a nutshell. You can go to either us.gov/archives or uscis.gov to go into it deeper. Understand, this is an overgeneralization of what the laws actually did. For the purposes of our discussion, for the purposes of my audience, this overgeneralization will work. So 1792, the federal government passed a law that said you had to be white, you had to be able-bodied, and you had to live here a minimum of originally 2, and later on it became 5 years in order to gain citizenship. If I'm not mistaken, since either Nixon or Reagan, it's been 7 years. The other set of laws that were passed were the Alien Enemies Act. The Alien Enemies Act allowed the president to issue deportation orders. The other thing it did was it took away First Amendment privileges that were granted to immigrants. In other words, you did not have a right to free speech if you were an immigrant. In 1864, the Congress decided to actually nationalize immigration. They put it under the newly formed Department of the Treasury, which is where it is today. In 2001, it was moved into the Department of Homeland Security. However, in 1864, they put a head tax on immigrants. In $25, it was a $15 per person tax that you had to pay. Everything else remained the same. You had to be white, you had to be able-bodied, and you had to live here for 5 years. About the time Theodore Roosevelt became president, shortly before that, I believe it was maybe 12 years before that, we began seeing an enormous influx. Because of the railroad and because there weren't enough people to work on the railroad, build the railroad, Chinese immigrants began flooding in. And they took all the railroad jobs because white people didn't want them. And it's important to note that the people that were here at the time, in the 1880s, did not want to work on the railroad. That has to be made known. Now, as a result of that, that flood of Chinese immigrants came in and took those railroad jobs. And of course, that made everybody angry. So in 1882, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which meant that you could not immigrate to the United States from China. It would later be repealed. I don't remember what year it was repealed, but you can look it up. I'll leave that as an exercise to the listener. Then in the late 1870s, late 1890s, we had this huge influx of immigrants come in. We had to actually nationalize and develop a system where we could absorb them in. And remember, we still don't have what would happen in 1964, right? So after the Vietnam War, we began getting more and more people come in to unite families. And in 1964, we would pass legislation to allow to do that. Now, in the interim, from the beginning, when we nationalized immigration to now, as a society, we didn't put any priority on it. It wasn't important to us. So the Immigration Department, from the get-go, has always been underfunded. It's never had the money it needed to operate, efficiently or otherwise. Here's where the problems begin. Let's split this off into the problems that the liberals and progressives created and the problems that the conservatives created. The liberals and progressives like to say, oh yeah, I'm pro-immigration. Immigrants are a net benefit. And they are. The data shows that clearly. There's no way to argue that on the facts alone. On the facts alone, immigrants are a net positive, period. There's no way to argue that. You can't use the facts to build an argument to state otherwise. They just aren't there. So for all the liberals and progressives that say, yes, immigration is a net positive, you're right, but what have you done about it? From the get-go, from the time that we nationalized immigration in 1864, the department was underfunded. It took you until about 1892 before you had any kind of set process, which meant from when you developed the Department of Immigration in 1864 to about 1892, it wasn't important enough for you to figure out how are we going to do this. It became important when the refugee crisis began in the post-Great War era. So we're talking about 1918, 1920. And you still did nothing to build a system which would account for all of the problems that you were going to face. You had about 40 years. By that time, you'd seen every problem you were going to have. And you did nothing. Now, conservatives, you have never made a fact-based statement about immigration. Not once, not ever. Not since 1776, when the United States was established as the Confederate States of America. You have never made a facts-based statement about immigration. All of your beliefs, all of your truths, everything about immigration in the conservative context has, without exception, always been false. Always. Conservatives have never made a fact-based comment on immigration. Now, for all of us as a whole, there's maybe about 1.5% of the entire U.S. population that knows enough about immigration. And please note, I'm not in that 1.5%. There's maybe about 1.5% of the U.S. population that knows enough about immigration to form an educated opinion. Which means that 98.5% of all the opinions on immigration are invalid. I'm not going to argue this point. I won't discuss it, whether I agree with you or not. You just don't know enough to have an opinion. There are plenty of resources. You can look it all up. You just don't want to. We'll go back to liberals and progressives. Yes, immigration is a net good. What have you done? We go to conservatives. Immigrants are stealing our jobs. And what have you done? The only solution the American electorate has ever voted for, ever, is to add more armed border guards. The problem has never been the border. The overwhelming majority of illegal immigrants are either here on an F visa or an H visa. It's important to note that those are the two visas that illegal immigrants were originally here under. Because if I'm here under an F visa and I can't get into school next semester, I can't reapply for a visa. I can't renew my visa, which means that it's up to the educational institution to guarantee my visa. Not me, not the immigrant. The educational institution guarantees the visa. The educational institution owns the visa. In other words, their immigration status is based on the university, not on any action they can take. H visas, you're here to do a job. It doesn't matter what that job is. If the employer does not endorse the visa, the immigrant cannot renew the visa. And especially when you get into the B class, HB visas. The HB visas are all low-skilled labor. There isn't a single low-skilled labor employee that has ever done anything other than turn over their quote-unquote illegal immigrants to the Trump administration. Yeah, so they're good enough to come and work for you for free, but they're not good enough for you to fill out the paperwork so you can renew their visa. I didn't misspeak. In your mind, they're good enough for you to come work for you for free, but they're not good enough for you to fill out the paperwork to continue their visa. So they can continue working for you for free. So I'll go back to my initial statement about conservatives and immigration. Everything you believe about immigration is a lie. You know it's a lie, you don't care. I'll say that again. Everything you believe about immigration is a lie. You know it's a lie, you don't care. Liberals, you've never done anything to counter those lies. You've never fought in the Congress to counter those lies. You've never fought in the court of public opinion to counter those lies. The only reason that you were able to fight in the courts was because of the 13th and 14th Amendment, which now, thanks to Chief Justice Samuel Alito, they don't exist anymore. Yes, I know. John Roberts is the Chief Justice in name. He's ineffectual, and he's a coward. All right, moving on. Again, important to note, you don't know enough about immigration for your opinion to be valid. Important to note, if you're a conservative, every belief you have about immigration is a lie. You know that. You don't care. If you're a liberal, yay, what have you done? In about 1918, we had a huge refugee crisis, and we began reforming the laws to allow for the refugee problem. We didn't give a great deal of consideration to what it would require to solve the refugee problem, as evidenced by the fact that we would turn away the German refugees that were trying to escape Nazi Germany. Never dawned on us that if we were going to take refugees, we should actually look at all of the refugees. So yes, we refused the Jewish refugees coming out of Nazi Germany. We could have taken them, we didn't. It's done. It's over. Another portion of our immigration policy was to erase the First Nations. We failed. The First Nations are still here. We injured them, but they survived. They're rebuilding themselves slowly, considering that every treaty that we make with them, we will violate. I mean, historically, that's what we've done. We violated every single treaty that we've made with the First Nations. And we keep violating them. They keep forgiving us. They keep rebuilding after we would destroy everything they built. But it's done. The Vietnam War created a large number of refugees out of Southeast Asia. And of course, the American electorate continues to fail to learn from their mistakes. They made the exact same mistakes they made in post-World War I, the exact same mistakes they made in post-World War II. And the foreign policy arm of the American government made the exact same mistakes that they made in World War I, in World War II. They made those exact same mistakes for Southeast Asia. I want to take a second here and point out that after the Spanish-American War, the United States became a colonizer just like the rest of Western Europe. Our objective in foreign policy was not, I repeat, our foreign policy objectives were not to spread democracy. Our foreign policy objectives were to steal natural resources. That's why we have so many problems in the U.S. That's why we have so many problems in the Middle East. Because all those tribal communities in the Middle East understand that we're there to steal from them. Same with Southeast Asia. Vietnam was a lesson for Southeast Asia. The European powers weren't there to help them. They were there to steal. They know this. They understand this. Now, who's actually really at fault for that? The American electorate. Why? Because you keep re-electing the same people. You re-elect the same thieves that create all of these problems, which create these immigration problems that you're so angry about. Stop stealing from them. In modern terms, most of the people that immigrate to America, they're not immigrating to America because there's freedom here. They're immigrating to America because they're safe from America here. Get that through your head. Especially if you're conservative. Get it through your head. They immigrate to America because they're safe from you. But go ahead, re-elect another Lindsey Graham. Re-elect another Newt Gingrich. Re-elect another Ronald Reagan. You're so angry about all these immigration problems, re-elect the people that keep creating them. I mean, that's what you're going to do anyway. Now, since you're going to do that, you don't have the right to complain. Let me reiterate for the conservatives. Since you're going to keep re-electing people that go overseas and steal natural resources, you don't have the right to complain. All right, let's get into the 1980s and beyond. The problem has always been a lack of caseworkers and a lack of immigration judges. However, you, the American electorate, continue to vote for armed border guards. Likely because you're stupid. Do I feel bad about calling you stupid? No, you keep making the same mistake over and over and over. It's the exact same mistake. You never learn. The legal definition for that is insanity. I'm not going to change your opinion. I get it. I understand that. And given the confrontational nature of this particular video, you're not going to do anything about it. I get that too. I just have to get it off my chest. The problem with the Immigration Service has always been a lack of caseworkers, a lack of judges for adjudication. Now, in 2025, as per Samuel Alito's Supreme Court, Immigrations and Customs Service does not need probable cause. As per Kristi Noem and Tom Homan, probable cause is the fact that you exist. Yes, I know. They're going to say, no, that's not true. And you're going to say, no, that's not true. But it is. Look at the actions. The actions are pretty clear. As far as ICE is concerned, the fact that somebody exists is probable cause. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement does not do any investigation. They do zero investigation. There have only been 4 news published cases of American citizens being deported. I guarantee you the number is much larger. And I guarantee you the number is going to grow. It's because there's no investigative requirement. None. And Samuel Alito is going to allow Immigration and Customs Enforcement to continue doing that. Tom Homan has made it clear that you don't have time to get detained. Excuse me. Let me correct my statement. Tom Homan has made it clear you don't have time to get arraigned. Once they pick you up, it's 10 hours, then you're deported. Even if they detain you in the United States, they're going to guarantee you don't get before a judge. I promise you that's what's going to happen. You'll never get to see a judge. You'll never have an arraignment. I promise you that's what's going to happen. Why? Because that was a logical conclusion from the beginning. If you're familiar at all with game theory, minimax theory states very clearly there was only one possible outcome for this. And that's an expansion of what we have now. Mass arrests, no probable cause, no due process. That was the only possible outcome. So when you tell me, no, this isn't what I voted for, this wasn't what I thought was going to happen, yeah, I know. You didn't think it was going to happen because you're stupid. It was the only possible outcome. It was the only way it could have gone. So no, it wasn't that you didn't want to vote for this. It's that you didn't care that this would happen. Because you knew it was going to happen. Whether you admit that to yourself or not, you knew. You knew and you didn't care. And I really think you should give that thought the weight it deserves. You knew and you didn't care. There's only one way to solve the immigration problem. Build a well-defined list of requirements to come in. Apply that completely across the board. So whether you're applying as a refugee, whether you're applying for asylum, whether you're applying as a student, apply it across the board. And keep it consistent. Get rid of the quota system. Right? So it doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter why you're applying. We have this many immigrants that the economy can handle. These are the requirements. This number of immigrants, these requirements. This is the system that we're going to have. And then make sure you have the caseworkers. Make sure you have the judges to adjudicate. Let me go further. And again, we're just talking about conservatives. We're not talking about anybody else now. So I'm speaking directly to the conservatives now. A 6-month-old child has no capability of understanding what's going on during the immigration process. If you go to an immigration prison and you call out the name of a 6-month-old child, even if they can speak, which a little self-awareness, they probably can't. Even if they can, they don't understand English. They're not going to be able to answer you. Who's going to advocate for them? Oh, that's right, you're conservatives. Nobody should advocate for them. Whatever happens to them is perfectly fine. If it happened to your child, it would be a crime. But they're immigrants, so it's fine. Whatever happens to them is cool. No, that's not what I'm... Yes, it is. It's exactly what you voted for. Don't tell me it's not what you believe. You are very clear. That's what you believe. I don't care what your mouth says. Your actions spoke much louder. You want the borders closed, that's fine. Understand what it means. Because you're not going to work at a hotel. You're not going to work on a farm. You don't want to do those things. It's beneath you. If it wasn't, you would have done it already. But you have no intention of doing it. So understand that when you close the borders, you reduce the amount of food production. Understand when you close the borders, you injure the hospitality industry. Get it through your head. Understand when you close the borders, you reduce the amount of workers in the meatpacking plants. Because you're not going to do those jobs. That means you reduce the amount of goods that you have available to purchase. It means your life becomes inconvenienced. Understand that that's what it means to close the border. Understand that when you voted for Trump because of immigration, you voted for far worse than what is happening now. And it will happen. Not too long from now, Tom Homan is going to break into a fifth-generation American's home. Tom Homan, not too long from now, will break into a fifth-generation American's home and deport them inside of 10 hours. There's nowhere to deport them to, but that's not important. And when you say, no, he won't, yes, he will. The statistical p-value for this is lower than 0, which means that it's an unrejectable conclusion. The probability of it happening is divinely certain. It's better than money in the bank. It will happen. And when you say that's not what I voted for, yes, it is. It's exactly what you voted for. There aren't any laws anymore. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is going to break all of the laws. They'll violate every single one of them. And Samuel Alito will guarantee that they can get away with it. And we have to look at this. If we want to complain about immigration, if we want to say the immigration system needs reform, we have to look here. And I agree, the immigration system does need reform. The only reform that's going to fix it is we need to increase the number of caseworkers and we need to increase the number of immigration judges. And when you increase them, by all means, increase them with people that fit your worldview. But don't claim you want a legal pathway while you go out of your way to elect people who are going to take away that legal pathway. Because, let's be honest with ourselves, you're lying. If you're going to elect people that remove the legal pathway, you don't want a legal pathway. You want a closed border. Which you've got no clue what that means. And then for the people on the left, yeah, it's not right. What are you doing? I think the biggest reason that I made this particular video was because of the old meme. For those of you who say, if I were in Nazi Germany at the time, I'd be doing what you're doing now is what you'd be doing. Because we are in Nazi Germany. This is exactly what the Germans went through in 1933. How are we going to choose to deal with it? I can't do anything. I don't have any power. Nobody watches my videos, so I know no one is going to see this. But this has to stop. You want to claim you're pro-immigrant? Get Ted Cruz out of office. Get rid of Jim Jordan. Get rid of Jim Comer. Get rid of Boebert and Green. Get rid of Rand Paul. You want to claim you're pro-immigrant? Get rid of the people that are trying to remove the legal pathways. You want to claim that you're pro-immigrant? For those employers and universities that don't fulfill their obligation to their immigrant students and immigrant employees? Give them real consequences. Prosecute them criminally. Give them fines they can't afford. Do something. You want to claim you're pro-immigrant? Give them a way to expedite their hearings. One other thing, I know somebody personally who her immigration problems directly root from a clerical error. It was an honest mistake. Anybody could have made it. But that honest mistake has cost her almost 30 years of her life. Going on 40 years of her life now. Immigration knows it was their fault. So they've chosen to do nothing about her case because they made a mistake. Let's hold immigration accountable for their mistakes. What does that mean? Let's start criminally prosecuting ICE agents that deport people that they shouldn't have deported. Let's start prosecuting it. Yeah, I know. We just don't hold law enforcement accountable in this country. We never have. Every time there's a George Floyd, we'll hold one, maybe two cops accountable. And then we close our eyes and pretend the problem doesn't exist anymore. With ICE, it's always going to exist. They have no intention of following the law. And the Supreme Court is going to allow them to break the law. So at the state level, hold them accountable. I don't know. I'm just a flunky. But this is why immigration doesn't work. This is why we'll never have immigration reform. All right, kids. I'll see you next time.